All right. Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with our next panel, Advances in Housing Mobility Policy and Funding. I'll be the moderator for this conversation. My name is Sonya Acosta, and I'm a policy analyst with the housing team at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Excuse any kind of nasally thing going on. I've got a cold. Which is now a thing since we're all interacting with one another again. For those who are unfamiliar, the Center on Budget is a nonpartisan research and policy institute focused on policies to reduce poverty and inequality. And we're also a member of Mobility Works. And I'm really excited to be able to moderate this panel today. So as I'm sure you're all at least vaguely aware, there is and has been a lot going on at the federal level lately, and that includes some really big opportunities for housing broadly and mobility. After having an administration that consistently proposed to slash HUD's budget and undermine important fair housing laws, we now have a president whose campaign proposals included universal vouchers and who appointed a HUD secretary who recognizes that poverty is a policy failure, not a personal one. And while not exactly universal vouchers coupled with robust services, Congress and the administration are currently, like this minute, working to pass the Build Back Better package, which would be a historic step forward that would broaden opportunity, reduce poverty substantially, particularly among children, and narrow the glaring racial disparities resulting from historic and ongoing discriminatory policies and practices. So the current package does include $24 billion for housing choice vouchers, including some funding for mobility services. Obviously, there's still some things going on, nothing is final, but this is where we're at right now. So to pass this Build Back Better package, Congress is using a special legislative process called reconciliation, which prevents bills from being filibustered and would allow them to pass this bill with a tie-breaking vote from Vice President Harris, if, of course, all Senate Democrats vote for the bill. But there are still additional funding opportunities through the annual appropriations process. So for the past decade, federal spending has been restricted by tight annual caps under the 2011 Budget Control Act. Those caps expired when the new fiscal year started on October 1st, and that created a new opportunity for policymakers to increase funding for critical programs. So far, the president's budget, requests, the House and Senate bills have included funding for new vouchers and mobility services. So lots of opportunities on several different fronts. So to help me kind of discuss all of these opportunities and think through what it means for mobility, I'm joined by 4 really fantastic panelists. So first, we'll hear from Stephen Norman, who is the Executive Director of the King County Housing Authority, which serves the Seattle suburban metro area. And he is also currently president of CLAFA and the chair of the board of CSH, Corporation for Supportive Housing, which for some reason that acronym always trips me up. But Stephen also helped establish CSH as its original vice president. We'll also hopefully be hearing from Christina Monroe, who is the clerk for the subcommittee on transportation and housing for the House Appropriations Committee. She previously worked for the Senate Committee on Appropriations as well as HUD. Then we'll turn to Peggy Bailey, who is the Senior Advisor on Rental Assistance to Secretary Fudge. Prior to joining HUD, Peggy was my boss as the Vice President of Housing Policy at CBPP, where she also served as Director of Connect the Dots, an initiative to strengthen the link between housing and health policy. Also joining us from HUD is Demetria McCain, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. Many of you probably already know Demetria from her previous role as President of Inclusive Communities Project in Dallas. So just as a reminder, we will have time for questions towards the end after we hear from each of our panelists. So please submit your questions as we're talking and we'll get to them towards the end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Stephen. Stephen, given all of these kind of different opportunities at the federal level, what can and should be done to expand mobility?
Well, thank you. First of all, good morning from the West Coast to everybody. I'm really going to speak today from a practitioner's perspective on what national policy should be to scale up these programs. KCHA currently serves about 13,000 households through its Section 8 program. We're in a growing suburban metropolitan area with both high poverty and high opportunity neighborhoods. We're not hyper segregated like some metropolitan areas, but we're seeing increasing segregation by race and income. And I think this is an important piece of the puzzle. We're losing housing affordability, that there's been a net loss of about 112,000 units in a county that were affordable at under 80% of AMI over the last decade. So this issue of availability beyond and above the landlord willingness to engage theme that I think you heard in the last session is a growing challenge. So these remarks are going to be focused on scaling mobility and broadening geographic choice. But I think that these efforts need to be framed within a larger agenda, which is about regional integration patterns and scaling not just mobility, but opportunity. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on in the conference. But I want to start by acknowledging the good work underway in Congress and at HUD. We're beginning to look seriously at how we move from demonstration programs to making broader geographic choice an integral part of the main HCV program. And I want to echo Deputy Secretary Todman. This is truly an amazing opportunity that we're presented with. We are potentially on the brink of expanding this program to thousands of new participants. So KCHA recently completed a 2-year randomized controlled trial along with Seattle Housing Authority to test approaches to facilitating mobility. I think Todd spoke briefly about this earlier. We essentially showed that the tools that we used, customized search assistance, increased landlord engagement, short-term financial assistance, all do the job, that we could get up to more than half of the households receiving this services, choosing to and being successful in moving into high opportunity neighborhoods. But how do we take this to scale? How do we take tools that we know work and integrate them into our core HCV programs? And I would say there are 3 key elements here: flexibility, funding, and integrating a broader kit of tools into the mobility efforts. And some of these are within the purview of Congress, such as funding. Others, such as flexibility, are in the purview of HUD, although there may be some statutory requirements in terms of creating the flexibility that we truly need. So KCHA is a moving to work housing authority. This flexibility has underpinned all of our efforts in a variety of different directions. So why is it flexibility necessary? What does it do? It both helps us to simplify operations and also to solve for local housing market conditions. So in terms of operations, we've gone to streamlined inspection protocols, including such things as landlord self-certifications on the resolution of minor fail items, flexible use of our HAP subsidies to provide an array of supports to ensure shopping success, landlord participation, ongoing housing stability. And then regarding local market conditions, this is again where flexibility is critical. We use a 6-tier zip code based payment standard system that covers 58 submarkets. The standards are updated twice a year. Currently, our payment standards range from about 77% to 121% of the regional FMR. The flexibility in system design, everything from the ability to geographically define local submarkets based on local conditions, to an ability to grandfather existing HAP amounts to avoid dislocation of existing program recipients is essential. A flexible small area FMR framework needs to be rolled out as part of any serious approach to scale. On the funding side, mobility programs are not cheap. First, HAP costs will go up. While there are some long-term cost containment benefits from not leading the market in the lower price neighborhoods, which is what happens in these neighborhoods when we utilize regional payment standards pegged to regional FMRs, more is still more. Under our current payment standards, the payment standard for a 2-bedroom in a tier 6 is about $250 over the FMR a month. This adds up quickly as households move into higher cost submarkets. There's a $600 swing between our tier 1 and our tier 6 2-bedroom rents. And we live in a world where some PHAs currently do not receive sufficient HAP to reach 100% utilization on their baseline vouchers. The cost of the counseling, landlord liaison work, and client assistance funds in our CMTO mobility project was about $2,600 per household. Very pleased to see significant funds for these efforts included in the House's appropriations proposal, also in the BBB, but these funds need to be baked into the baseline budget for the voucher program. And administrative costs to run these programs needs to be fully funded. They're currently at 84% prorate in these programs, and the ability to do things such as pick up broker fees to really provide the kind of TLC that landlords require, we have to be up to 100% funding on the admin side. Then there's a question of other tools and how you use them in conjunction with tenant-based vouchers. And currently, we have 31% of the extremely low-income households with children that KCHE serves under sections 8 and 9 live in high opportunity neighborhoods as defined by either the Kerwin Institute or the Opportunity Insight metrics. So there are two other key elements in addition to our mobility counseling and landlord outreach and client assistance programs. First is that we've purchased over 4,000 units of unsubsidized housing in opportunity neighborhoods. These are naturally occurring affordable housing. It's older Class B 100-unit plus complexes. There are no subsidies attached to these units. The mix of incomes is up to about 80% of AMI, but we're a welcoming landlord. And roughly 15% of these 4,000 units are occupied by tenant-based voucher holders who've wanted to move into opportunity neighborhoods and couldn't find rental housing. So core piece of this is an overlay of social housing in opportunity neighborhoods. A second thing that we're doing is we're buying smaller complexes in the 10 to 30 unit range. We're turning on banked Faircloth ACC. One example is a 30-unit complex we bought on Mercer Island, a very high-end community. Average household income on Mercer Island is $225,000. We now have 30 units of public housing there as well. We've done over a dozen of these kind of purchases to create new place-based affordable housing in these high opportunity neighborhoods. So again, it's the flexibility, it's the ability to integrate a suite of approaches and tailor strategies to solve local market challenges. So what are the biggest challenges I think we face scaling this up? One is discrimination. This is real. Source of income discrimination, which we now have on a statewide basis in Washington State, is not a silver bullet. As they mentioned in New York, we need real monitoring and real enforcement on these laws to make sure that they are actually being utilized effectively. We've got a question about market absorption capacity. The rental supply in many high opportunity neighborhoods is vastly outstripped by demand. This is a long-term challenge. I think we're seeing it in a lot of places. Even without getting folks into high opportunity neighborhoods, we are finding that the issue isn't enough landlords, the issue is enough units that these landlords have. We're not keeping up on the production side. Recognition that there will be rising rental costs in high opportunity neighborhoods, that the rents here will be going up faster than in perhaps larger markets or other markets. The FM calculations can't lag market. Otherwise, we're putting folks we have moved into these neighborhoods into impossible conditions. And finally, this concept of persistence. Raj Chetty's research shows that the benefits of mobility closely linked to the amount of time spent in high opportunity neighborhoods. I think early mobility efforts showed that persistence was a challenge because of program design, social isolation, high cost of living, escalating rents, transportation challenges. Folks moved back into lower opportunity, more racially segregated neighborhoods. So I think the next frontier in research is how do we basically assure persistence once we get people into these neighborhoods, be it by the kind of ongoing post-move supports, be it by looking at whether hard units actually increase level of persistence. We're now currently working with the Urban Institute to look at comparative persistence rates between hard units and tenant-based units in high opportunity neighborhoods to see if there are lessons that can be learned. But this is a set of issues around resources and flexibility that I think have to be addressed as we try to scale these programs up. And now is the time we really have a once in a generation opportunity.
Thanks, Stephen, so much for that. So Stephen kind of laid out some of the needs on the funding as well as maybe some legislative or regulatory needs. So first we're going to start with the funding, and I'm going to turn it over to Christina just to talk about the prospects for additional funding in the next year. That's as far as we can look right now, I think.
Hi, everybody. For some of you, it's a good morning. For some of us, it's a good afternoon. But I'm happy to be here today to talk to you all and really learn from folks both on the panel, but out in the audience about innovative strategies and ways that we can think about targeting federal investments that really move the needle on mobility. Really, a lot of what we do in Congress on an annual basis is, as Stephen described, is really look at some of the local initiatives that, have either been targeted through federal resources or just utilizing existing flexibilities like the Moving to Work demonstration to really inform how we can make incremental progress, both on mobility, but getting additional housing resources out there for families that are most in need. This year is very unique for appropriations and Congress in general in that we have the opportunity to pass landmark legislation that will really move the needle, both from a rental subsidy perspective, but housing choice perspective. And so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about reconciliation, although I work for the Appropriations Committee. We don't really hold the pen on reconciliation, but certainly have a seat at the table and are part of the discussions on some of those long-term investments. Normally the way that this process works between the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee is that we put out our own respective bills. In the past, we have targeted investments to the tune of $50 million for the housing mobility demonstration that we see as an opportunity to see where there may be puts and takes, policy changes that we may need to consider as we think about expanding investments. But we have the housing mobility demonstration that is underway that was adopted via appropriations as a way to really understand how mobility could actually become a successful tool for housing authorities, but also as a way to monitor the influence that mobility counseling has on the long-term costs for vouchers and housing assistance in general. We in appropriations are really mindful of our ability to hold true on our commitment to keep folks housed. And so we have, over the last few years, invested in the demonstration as a way to learn more about the long-term commitment and the flexibilities that are needed as part of those investments. Flash forward to FY 2021, today, November 4th, we don't just have the appropriations vehicles as an opportunity to learn and expand on useful tools like the demonstration. You have the reconciliation bill that affords longer term multi-year investments, both for rental subsidies as well as mobility. And so a lot of what our decisions will center around as it relates to the fiscal year 22 investments for the FHEO appropriations bill is really, kind of what will we learn and what can we do with the funds provided through reconciliation. So reconciliation at this point in time includes I believe $300 million for mobility related services, but it's also paired with targeted investments for landlord incentives. In addition to a multi-year investment for housing vouchers. Concurrently, you have in the House introduced appropriations bill, $150 million to build on the existing housing mobility demonstration that is currently underway at HUD. The Senate included a $75 million carve out for new vouchers, of which $16 million can be used for mobility and landlord incentive type activities. So you've got three different vehicles that are showing a commitment to mobility. I would say that those three vehicles have different parameters and belts and suspenders around the use of that funding. And I think that we in Congress will have to do some listening and responding to ensure that whatever we end up doing through the appropriations process is complementary and helpful and not overburdensome as you all look to draw down on these resources in future years. But the big question becomes, when does reconciliation pass? What will that interplay be on appropriations? We don't see reconciliation as a means for supplanting what we do through annual appropriations, but it certainly will be a point of consideration. So all of the folks here today that are on the panel, both from a practitioner perspective, but also from an implementation perspective at HUD, will be very influential in the final decisions around the way that we think about mobility and expanding access to housing in areas of low poverty, all with the shared goal of helping people move out of poverty and stay out of poverty. So, again, a unique year, but certainly a number of opportunities to really make transformational change at the local level. The Appropriations Committee likely will be the last to make the decision on what those investments will look like in fiscal year 2022. So while there are differences in the House and Senate appropriations bills on mobility, I think there's opportunity to really shape that as a complementary investment to what is hopefully passed as part of reconciliation. So I am happy to answer questions during the Q&A, but really, like a lot of you, I'm here to learn from the other astute panelists to see how Congress can really help you all and what to be the dire needs on the ground. So thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Christina. It's so helpful just to kind of be reminded of the different proposals out there and how they all fit together. So now that we've kind of touched on the funding side, I'm going to move to Peggy to talk about what might be happening at HUD in this area.
Great, thanks, Sonia. It's good to see you. It's good to see everybody else too. And thank you for inviting HUD here today. I think the things that Demetria will share are probably more pointed, but from the Secretary's office, a couple of things. First, I think that, as the president says, and so does Secretary Fudge, right? You can tell someone's priorities or an organization's priorities by their budget. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what your priorities are. And you can tell from the president's budget submission earlier this year that mobility and mobility services are of a high priority. And we're really appreciative to the work that Christina and the House Appropriations Committee has done to support us in that effort, both from the services standpoint and also from adding additional vouchers. I think what we're trying to do is twofold: support the unique services that are needed to help families access new neighborhoods, but also take the lessons that we've learned from mobility and ingrain them into the broader voucher program, as Stephen mentioned. Many of the things that you're all doing in the mobility space, you're only having to do it narrowly in that space due to the scarcity of resources broadly. And a lot of those things could be done to also improve the housing conditions of all families receiving vouchers and strengthen the program. And not only strengthen the program, but also are going to be vitally needed as we grow the program. Because the other goal for President Biden and the Secretary is to get to the day when we have universal voucher assistance. So particularly in the space of landlord recruitment, that will be vital. Having a voucher is only one step in the process. We have to have landlords who are going to accept voucher families. And so Demetria will talk about the fair housing pieces of that, but there's also what we've learned is regarding the carrots that we can provide to engage landlords in the program are vitally important. So we're walking this twofold process of moving forward with the mobility demonstration and investing in it, but as I said, recognizing that we know a lot about what families need and what it takes to help families. So the vision moving forward really is about providing additional technical assistance to PHAs as they implement and strengthen mobility services, doing things. As you can also tell in our budget that we asked for increasing admin fees broadly, because so much of what happens in the mobility space could be done if PHAs had more administrative resources, and tying those to implementing best practices is a high priority for us as well. I think moving forward, out of once we get through appropriations and the Build Back Better plan passing Congress, we'll be continuing to move forward on the universal voucher assistance vision, and being able to get to that day when all families who are eligible for federal rental assistance can achieve it, can have it. And have it for however long that they need it. The other piece, though, of the puzzle is solving for the fact that we do have this disparity between zip codes and neighborhoods, and looking for ways that we can invest in communities is something that we're not forgetting at HUD, and is also included in the Build Back Better plan. Additional resources for the Community Development Block Grant, a really creative new program called the Community Revitalization Fund that is intended to invest in community-based organizing groups so that the community can have a voice and a seat at the table as cities look to determine where resources can be invested and how to protect communities. Zoning and providing carrots to communities to improve to implement inclusive zoning strategies locally, and as I said, taking a carrot approach to that, because we feel that oftentimes there's a focus on the communities that have already done the work, or communities that are maybe offenders in this space. but there's nothing for those folks in the middle, the folks in the middle who with additional resources could do some really great work. And that's the way that the Unlocking Possibilities program is designed, that's moving through Congress right now. So those are all some of the things that we're thinking about. As I said, both how can we strengthen the voucher program to be able to implement mobility strategies singularly? How do we take the lessons learned and move them into the broader voucher program so that we're providing that strong foundation that we need as we increase the availability of voucher assistance, and then investing in communities so that we have more communities of opportunity for people to be able to live in and thrive. And that's the various buckets that we're thinking about how this work should advance. And I'll pass it on back to Sonya.
Thanks, Peggy. It's so exciting to hear about the big goals at HUD and everything that's happening. So to hear a little bit more and kind of specifically about some of the fair housing tools that HUD is revisiting, reworking, however you want to phrase it, I'm going to turn it over to Demetria.
All right, thank you, Sonya. So good to be around friends and folks that I know. And really, Peggy said quite a bit that relates to some of the work that HUD's doing. But for folks who maybe are kind of new to the housing mobility space, I know there's some veterans around. I just want to point out from the fair housing and equal opportunity perspective that clearly mobility is a way to affirmatively further fair housing, right? Depending on what's going on in the jurisdiction regarding the data, regarding the population, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So while many of you in this audience are practitioners and experts in your space of vouchers and more specifically housing mobility, I just want to make sure that you're thinking perhaps more broadly, right, as this being a tool towards fair housing. Sonya kind of teed up what we've been working on diligently inside the building, so to say, these days, the virtual building, is really kind of improving upon the 2015 AFFH rule. Many of you already know, and if you don't, we did provide earlier, before the work that we're doing now, we kind of reinstituted the definitions from the original rule that had been taken away and the certification requirements. So PHEs and other HUD grantees are required to follow those today. But in the meantime, we've been conducting a number of listening sessions. Some of you may have participated in those with stakeholders from all viewpoints, including folks like yourselves. We're kind of rounding the corner of that right now. I cannot give you a specific date, but we do hope to have a rule out within months. That's about as close I can come to giving you any specifics right now. But really, I really want to advise you all that as we're doing the work on this side and preparing for the revision of that rule, that you're starting to take stock, take inventory of your jurisdictions, and understand that it's not simply PHAs who have the duty to affirmatively further for housing. They're also cities and counties and states, right? And so while we're talking about funding by way of public housing monies, when you're thinking about how can a particular jurisdiction affirmatively further for housing, I invite everyone to think outside the box. I invite PHAs to think outside the box. I invite advocates to think outside the box. So how can all of the players and stakeholders come together to affirmatively further fair housing? And on the issue that Steve brought up regarding source of income discrimination, I just want to point out that we have what's called FHEOs. These are our nonprofits around the country who kind of help us really kind of strengthen the Fair Housing Act by doing investigations and those types of things and enforcement. We made it very clear to our FHEOs around the country earlier this year that they can use the money they get from us from HUD to do testing on source of income discrimination. So if you are in a part of the country that happens to have one of these nonprofit FHIPs, perhaps you'd like to talk to them about doing some investigations around source of income discrimination. I know you know it exists already, but that information perhaps may be useful. There are a couple of studies done that are posted on the HUD Exchange website that PDR posted by various people, the most recent being the Urban Institute that studied 5 cities and saw how rampant source of income discrimination was. That was back in 2018. But those kind of things I think may be helpful as we continue the conversation, particularly through the prism of whether or not, you know, housing mobility actually furthers fair housing. And to the extent that PHAs and folks did not get an opportunity to participate in the demonstration from an AFFH point of view, there are clearly some administrative matters that PHAs may want to look at that's within their own control of how they administer their program that would perhaps aid in housing mobility, even though there may not be a specific housing mobility program or participation in a housing mobility demonstration. So we're working on the rule. It's forthcoming is what I can say, but use all the tools. I mean, Stephen's example is great, but he admitted that he is not in a hyper-segregated jurisdiction, and some of you are. So to that extent, use all of the tools and bring this conversation outside of the silo of public housing and vouchers and discuss this perhaps, if it's an issue in your jurisdiction, as a fair housing matter. Sorry if I've taken up too much time.
No, not at all. So before I get to any audience questions, I just want to give our panelists a chance to maybe any kind of responses to something that someone else said or any questions for each other, kind of a few minutes for conversation if anybody has anything.
Would love to hear what the audience thinks about where we are. We talk a lot. Really, let's be open and get it from the audience.
Great. All right. So we had a question to hear a little bit more on small area FMRs. So maybe a timeline for when mandatory metro areas might be expanded, or ways to encourage more PHAs to adopt small area FMRs.
So I can start with that by also probably not saying, you know, it's under, not saying a ton, but, you know, it would be great to hear from folks regarding FMRs and small area FMRs but FMRs broadly, because we know right now is another reason why now is an interesting time, that there are rent costs that have spiked in some peculiar places across the country that could cause real problems in voucher programs locally, and so it is on our radar. It would be great to hear from you all about ways that HUD could be helpful, but it is something that we're trying to navigate through. And it is our intent to look at ways to advance the implementation of small area FMRs. Not only we see that as a key piece of our broader equity work, both as it relates to racial equity, but also what I don't think it's talked about enough is the role that small area FMRs can play for people with disabilities as well, and being able to help them access higher cost housing locally, given especially in the ways that we need to help increase the voucher value for families with a member with a disability, since housing is more expensive. So that's all to say that we know that we're in not only do we need to simply advance policies, advance the implementation of small area FMRs, but we also need to think about how HUD can be a little more nimble right now in this moment, and we're trying to think through that right now. And if you have more questions on that, Todd who was the moderator for the session earlier, is the person to direct those questions to.
Great, thank you so much, Peggy. So I think this next question would be for Demetria. How is HUD promoting or encouraging collaboration among FIP grantees for cross-jurisdictional and regional testing, particularly on source of income discrimination?
Actually, I'm glad that came up. I actually don't have a specific answer for you at the moment, but I certainly can go back and check with my colleagues who focus on that area and get back to you, Adria and others, for certain. But it makes perfect sense to me that, you know, regional testing, we've got regional housing markets. So point well taken.
Great, thank you. So this is kind of a big future question. So anybody who has ideas, we'd love to hear them. In a future that sees universal voucher access, like Peggy talked about, how might the role of public housing authorities evolve, if at all?
Oh,
Well,
Stephen, did you?
Peggy,
Yeah,
please.
No, well, yeah, you can. I'm curious to see. I mean, that is a hot topic and something that's on our agenda now. And I think as we look to how we get to that day, there are going to be several tension points, because right now we have a program that's designed in an environment of scarcity, and that creates significant layers of the process. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, there is a lot to think about when it comes to the PHA space and implementation, and trying to implement a universal program with so many entities at the local level carrying those programs out, with each of them. You know, as Sonya talked about, a lot of my experience is in the intersection of health and housing. And in that space, in the Medicaid space, you always say that when you've seen one Medicaid program, you've only seen one Medicaid program, and there are 50 plus DC in the territory Medicaid programs. Well, think about the voucher program, and there being thousands of PHAs with all of the uniqueness that brings. So what we've charged the PHA industry groups is to think this through, right? And be a thought partner with HUD as we think about what the evolution of the voucher program should look like moving forward. And that's something that in the near future, we'll start to have not just PHAs, but people who are receiving assistance now, people who want to receive rental assistance, and the other stakeholders engaged in the program. We need to hear from everyone so that we can create a program that works at a much larger scale going forward.
No, I would completely agree and very much appreciate the housing authorities being at the table. We do need to sit back and think strategically about what this will look like if we actually get to the point where this is a program where we have universal coverage. And I think the point about how balkanized the service delivery is within specific housing markets is a good one. And even as I make the points for local flexibility in responding to local markets, to the degree that you have multiple players within that market, you're just complicating things. So I think that there is a long, productive conversation that needs to be had about how we consolidate delivery within markets so that you don't have landlords dealing with multiple housing authorities with multiple rules. You don't have folks porting from one part of a region to another part of the region and finding that the rules of engagement with the housing authority have changed. We do need to figure it out on a regional housing market basis, how we simplify and scale up delivery. So complete agreement.
I think the other thing I would say too is that hopefully, or should, in order to work, will break down the silos that we have within our own family, right? We're going to have to think through, you know, the divide that we have between the homeless system and the housing system is insane, really. And then thinking about what we have, the divides we have between, so my job is senior advisor on rental assistance, and we have multifamily, and we have the multifamily programs that operate over here in an age of universal assistance. These three buckets: homelessness, the multifamily programs, and the rental assistance programs within PIH will all need to come together, because it will then create an opportunity to coordinate on the services side too. I mean, when you line up the services that it takes to house someone experiencing homelessness, and even look at the more intensive mobility services, some of the uniqueness because of the family's needs might be different, but the buckets of the services are quite similar. And the expertise that it could take to deliver those services, if we shift ourselves to be a more resident-focused industry, we'll be able to, we could streamline not only the housing assistance, but the services as well.
Completely agree. I think the BASH program shows that you can actually start to coordinate. It has its bumps, but the concept, I think, is valid, that we have to understand that the services follow the people, integrate into the housing. One of the things that the Emergency Housing Voucher Program is doing is it's bringing both CPD and PIH to the table, where we can actually have those cross-silo dialogues. So I think this is an ongoing challenge, both within HPD, but then in a broader set of agencies involved in the human service funding sources and Treasury, that we increasingly try to combine to look at common outcomes.
And if I might add, from a congressional perspective, you know, the universal voucher proposal is certainly something that you will hear very few members oppose or fail to support, in terms of the need we know exists across the country related to affordable housing. But I would expect that, you know, as people are thinking about universal vouchers and the mobility services, landlord incentives that come along with making those resources successful, is that there will likely need to be a larger role that authorizers play beyond the investment of vouchers. As Peggy talks about the different buckets across multifamily, supportive services, rental assistance, a part of those buckets exists because of the way that we fund these programs on an annual basis through the appropriations process. And so when you look at something like a universal voucher proposal, it warrants a broader conversation around, you know, how are we using things like the moving to work demonstration, the mobility demonstration, to really inform a longer term comprehensive strategy on really transforming the livelihoods of people who need the assistance. And so I think there would be a shift of making incremental progress and making tweaks to programs, which we are often afforded through the annual appropriations process. And so I just would encourage that as we look to proposals like the universal voucher proposal, that there is a longer term conversation about what that would mean for shifting committees of jurisdiction, but also being thoughtful in what you would want if you had one opportunity to make that legislation possible, because you don't see authorization bills moving through the process to really help meet the flexible needs that you all identify as you move through implementation. And so it will be a tough conversation, but one that I think is well warranted. And I think that there have been past investments that have really been building up to this moment to have a more comprehensive conversation around what this would mean for the PHA industry writ large.
Yeah, and so I know that we have to get to other questions, but just to give an example of what Christina's talking about, right? Like through the family self-sufficiency program, we have learned that it is designed well to help families save money. There are other pieces of the program that we know we struggle with, right? Making sure that people can access better jobs or increase their income even only happens incrementally, but we know it does a good job of helping people save money. We also know that there's a little bit of a disparity, right? Families who receive rental assistance have more of their income go toward rent, or have their rent costs increase as their income goes up, in a ways that other families don't. Even if those families are paying more, they still know that, if they make more money, their rent costs are going to stay the same. How do we take lessons learned from FSS to help families save money and create equities around this increasing the amount that people pay in their rent automatically as their income goes up, and some of the challenges that can create for families? How do we even that out? Because if we get to a stage of universal assistance, you could have people decline assistance because they don't really like that component of the program. So that's just an example of taking lessons that we've learned and really examining our programs to think about how would we do this differently, or would we do this differently if we had a universal assistance, and can we take some lessons learned from what we are doing that help families in the long run.
Thanks so much to you all, and thanks for that great question, whoever submitted it. I forgot. But right, there's still a lot of conversations that people are having and that we still need to have, and it's really exciting to be talking about that transformative change, like Christina said, instead of just the incremental things. So there's been a few questions in the chat about national source of income protections, and so just to clarify, is that something that Congress would have to do, or is that something that HUD could implement in some way?
I suppose I could take that question. I think based on some of the tools that we have now, we're looking at source of income protections in general. I can say that much at this time. Certainly, we're hoping to release the disparate impact rule pretty soon. But as far as the other part of the question, I can't forecast that.
Thanks, Demetria. So there was also a few questions around some of the flexibilities that Stephen talked about. Since King County is an MTW, what recommendations do you have, Stephen, for PHAs who don't have MTW status, particularly concerning purchasing rental properties in high opportunity areas to kind of secure that source of affordable housing? We'll just start there.
Well, I think 2 points. One, a general one, and I think it goes back to some of the comments that Peggy and Christina were making about how do we create a cycle where we are taking the lessons learned and what we are experiencing, and in real time make the adjustments in the programs to make them more effective. And much of this is done through the appropriations process. But I would argue that there's a need for greater flexibility on the part of the HUD secretary to grant waivers and to experiment on the programs. There's a lot of statutory restrictions on how much discretion is provided to the HUD secretary. And I would say that I think we need to look at how we can create more flexibility on the departmental level to do the kind of innovations that everybody is talking about. The issue of the acquisition programs is one that is done without any HUD involvement. So this actually doesn't really bring in our MTW flexibilities into place. We're fortunate because we started doing this at a point where you could pick up multifamily housing in this county in a market in the early 1990s that you could basically pay for it out of cash flow. Flash forward, we're at a point where we're at a below 4, sub 4 cap rate on acquisitions, which means that if you're going to try to pay off the cost of buying it through the cash flow at existing rents, you're going to have a big gap, an equity gap that has to be filled in other ways. We've used ways in which we can borrow against the equity in seasoned properties, but increasingly what we've done is we've partnered with other sources of low-cost financing, and we've gotten about $240 million in below-market financing from tech companies in the region who are becoming concerned about the fact that the job base, the higher paying job base that they are bringing to these communities is essentially displacing much of the existing community, and that this is not a long-term strategy if you're going to really put your market down in terms of this being a central office location for you. So I think really the question I see in terms of scaling this up is how do we get Treasury involved? Arguably, Treasury could provide financing that would be fully paid for over time by the acquisition of these properties. So it costs the taxpayers nothing, but it would be at rates that were essentially sufficiently affordable that we could go out and buy more properties even at current market acquisition prices. Varies from market to market, but it is possible. I think this overlay of social housing as a frame in which our extremely low income affordable housing efforts takes place. This is an established concept in social democracies in Western Europe. Vienna has been doing it since World War I. It's one of the reasons why they have their affordable housing issues, I think, under better control in these countries. Something we need to look at, a key part of the overall picture.
Demetria?
Sonya, I just want to say that we are trying to be very intentional about hearing people with lived experiences as we create policy. So I see there's a comment there regarding voucher families getting involved. That's something that we want to be intentional about. And the Secretary is very interested in that as well. So we welcome hearing from folks.
Yeah, and that'll be a panel coming up later about how to work with people with lived expertise and in creating policies and programs, the PHE level, I think. So thanks to the panelists for taking the time to join us. Thank you to everybody who attended and asked great questions.